Good morning to you. Today is Sunday. It is September 14th. It's about 6 in the morning right now. I had bought a new camera for my computer, and unfortunately, the audio wasn't coming through very well. So I have to go back to the laptop and do everything this way. The technical issues over here are unfortunate, but I'll deal with it. Today I got a special one for you. A very unique one. Okay? It's called Patrick O'Brien's Navy, an illustrated companion to Jack Aubrey's World. Okay, the author is Richard O'Neill. It's been published by Running Press. And I tell you what, looking at this, yes, this is essentially a coffee table book. I measured it out. It's like 18 inches on one side by 18 inches on the other side. When I'm finished with this and I put it on my shelf, I'm not exactly sure where it's going to fit along everything else. However, I had to seek this special one out because I definitely wanted to read it. Because I have to go into some background to what this is even for, who's Jack Aubrey, and all that kind of stuff. So, in case you're not familiar, let me tell you why I got in for this one. So in 2003, Russell Crowe and Paul Bettany starred in the movie together called Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World. Okay? It takes place on the ocean during the time of the Napoleonic Wars. And what we're talking about here is Britain, Her Majesty's ships, HMS, whatever you want to call it. That's what we're focusing on. A ship of the British fleet who's out in the middle of the ocean, and they're taking on France. And we're more concerned with the sea battles of the war between England and France and Napoleon versus just England's war in general on land. Specifically, we are following two people who are friends. Captain Jack Aubrey, who in the movie is played by Russell Crowe, and Dr. Stephen Maturin, who's the ship's surgeon. And I'll tell you what, I saw this movie and just fell in love with it. Some proclaim that it's the perfect movie, and that's one that I echo the sentiments of. And while watching it, it kind of cemented in me a little-known desire that I had for things that are nautical. It gives you a pretty good account of ship life and how the world is when you're at sea. And not just for the captains and the first mates, but also for the deckhands and those that are the young living in Her Majesty's Royal Navy. Because they can take some kids pretty young, so they kind of grow up on the sea, and they can learn so much when doing so. And they make better officers and captains in the future. If you've not watched it, I highly recommend it. And based upon this newfound love of large frigates and action involving broadsides, I actually have a few other books on my shelf that I'll get to reading sometime probably in 2026 that I'm looking forward to. The two examples I have are this one here called High Seas, Stories of Battle and Adventure from the Age of Sail. And another one right here. Great Stories of the Sea and Ships. So, I pick these kind of things up in used book sales and say, hey, looks pretty interesting, let me throw it up on my shelf, and I get around to it in time. I had so many books of that nature at one point that it was interesting. I would actually get into certain themes from time to time. Like there was one time I think I had 2 or 3 books regarding the Civil War. And all of a sudden I was like, I want to get to those, and I kind of read them back to back. Or maybe I want to get into a real sci-fi kick, and I'll grab a couple books off my shelf that are there and go through them. So I had so many of, hey, this looks interesting, that when do you put it next on your list is all a matter of when you get around to it. I don't want to get you down the rabbit hole of just talking about the movie, though. So I want to talk to you about why the movie was made. Because Hollywood generally wants to see if they can attach themselves to like a film franchise. And if they get it, they can crank out 4, 5, 6 of these things and just make tons of money by doing so. Well, it turns out that Master and Commander, The Far Side of the World, is actually based upon a book series that was written by Patrick O'Brian. He wrote 20 books with these two characters in this setting. And on the strength of this movie alone, I sought out these books. And I've read them all. One day, I will reread them. And at that time, I'll probably do a video on them as well, because it's well deserving that they get their own video separately. And as an aside, the books themselves, you can get them in a variety of formats. I'm one that loves having all the books in a similar format, so when I put them on my bookshelf, they're all uniform. They all look the same in a way that you can say, oh, this is a book series. But I try not to get like the paperback of one and the hardcover of another and a trade paperback of another and have them all disjointed. That's kind of an OCD thing about me. So I'll put some pictures up here as I go along. This is the set I initially picked up from a used bookstore. I think I got about 14 of them, and then I had to chase down the other 6 just to make sure I got them all in the same format. Looks great on my shelf, and the cover art of these frigates on sea, it blows your mind. Another similar set in the series looks kind of like this one here, where, all the spines are the same. They're all looking pretty good. And there's another example here. There's a hardcover omnibus edition of this, too, which looks great. I mean, you get 4 large hardcovers that carry all 20 books, and then you just have that all art. Sometimes it's in a slipcase, sometimes it's not, but then you can look at that on your shelf and just enjoy it that way. And then there are some special editions of this. These ones here in blue are from the Folio Society that was released monthly or whatever the periodic release date was over time, and they look beautiful. And lucky enough, I was able to try this one more time. I was lucky enough to find this set, and I actually have it for myself as well. Cost a pretty penny, but I still got it under the market value of this, so I was very happy to get this set. And I'm actually looking forward to another set that came out by Easton Press. That's these leather-bound editions. And they look like this. But either format you get them, it's a great book series to get your hands upon. And hopefully it's right up your alley if you give it a shot. So these are commonly known as the Aubrey Maturin series. Jack Aubrey, Stephen Maturin. The books came out between 1969 and 1999. And they're all set in the early 19th century. In fact, the name of the movie is taken directly of 2 names of the books mashed together. Because the movie takes about 2 or 3 storylines and makes one tale about it. Which, again, it's a fantastic movie, fantastic books. Patrick O'Brian himself intertwines actual historical events into his novels, either integrating these characters into the actual naval action without changing the outcomes, or adapting historical events as templates to tell you a different tale. There's some specific nautical technology and terminology that is used throughout the books, but they kind of get around that in a way by having a side character, either someone brand new to being on the ocean in the crew, or even Dr. Maturin himself, who's not a Navy man, as a person that just needs some explaining to. And they actually illustrate such a thing in the movie, and a couple times in the books also, where, say, because of certain wind conditions, maybe the ship needs to head north for a while into the winter climes before they can actually turn and go to the direction they want. These are sailing frigates. The wind dictates where they go. So, at one point, I think they're in the middle of a dinner, and they can kind of see one of the mechanisms of the rudder in the ceiling, and they see the rudder moves, and all the officers cheer, "Hey, huzzah!" And Maturin's like, I think something profoundly nautical has just occurred that I'm not aware of. And then there's a quick demonstration and description of what the weather gauge is. And that kind of happens for us. So they can talk in detail, but then also let you know what they're talking about at the same time. As for me, I prepared myself before I read these books, because I noticed there was a schematic in the front of the book. I'll put them up here. And it shows a ship, and apparently it has like 3 masts, and there's 3 or 4 sails on every mast. And each one has a specific term and name. So the design, the illustration, has the labels of all the different sails on the ship. And I had printed this out and actually left it on my desk at work that I can glance and refer to just to kind of like get myself familiar with it. So therefore, I was able to build for myself a direction on the ship. If they spoke about a problem with the top gallants, which they sometimes refer to simply as the topgallants, I would know where on the ship they're talking about and what problem is going on. You know, the difference between mainstays and the mizzen and the flying jib or the spanker. These are different sails on the ship. So at least I was kind of familiarized myself with the geography of a ship and where a problem might be. And when they have a problem or tell someone to go do something with it, in my mind, I have them going to the correct part of the ship. And I'll know where they're talking about it and not just be lost in the fog of one of them thar sails. So, yeah, I was invested in this early. So, needless to say, I was quite a fan of the series. Now, after that long introduction for you, let's move on to what this book is about. Again, Navy, an illustrated companion to Jack Aubrey's world. So now, we know who the captain is. Let's find out about the time period. Let's find out about the ships. Let's find out about what's going on, economics, politics, what have you, just to help dive into the world better and get an understanding. About 150 pages in total. Very, very illustrated, showing both amazing reproductions of prints of ships at sea, and also little cartoons that may have been published in newspapers and periodicals of its time. The book's broken down into 7 chapters, and I'm going to spend the time today talking about them, letting you know what's going on here. The first chapter is known as The World That Jack Knew. It goes into the various coalitions that were created during this period from like 1792 to 1809, because there were about 5 of them. And it shows, one by one, how the countries would be allies, and then not allies, and maybe fluctuate with the loyalties of the time. So you can know what countries were at sea together at what time during the course of this decade or so. So it's interesting to show how, or to read about how the loyalties are constantly back and forth. They don't go into the details of why they changed or what happened. They're just saying, well, for this time period, it was these 3 countries, then it was those 5, then it was those 2, yada yada. The chapter gives an overview of the general sizes and strengths of the French and the English navies, and the shortage of sailors and men to man them that they encountered during this whole period. Emphasis is given on a few of the engagements that arose during this period, or even the use of blockades as a strategic maneuver. You get to see the battles that made Admiral Nelson an admired ship's captain. So overall, you get a sense of what's actually going on in the world as a backdrop to where our beloved Jack Aubrey comes into play, and where he fits into the overall scheme of the time. In Chapter 2, it's all about Aubrey's England. In that chapter, you get to dive into more of the country of England, where Jack Aubrey is coming from. It discusses some of the economies of England and their urban growth, the importance of trade, and the necessity of hard currencies, gold bullion, silver, which primarily came from Brazil, and Mexico and Peru. There was an end to the War of Spanish Succession, which eventually led into the War of Jenkins' Ear, or the War of Austrian Succession. Not directly, but intercolonial wars sprung up as the need arose to get more from them. At the same time, the Industrial Revolution was taking hold in Europe. And in the novels, Jack Aubrey's father was a vociferous, was in opposition to his own government. Jack himself has money problems. And all of this make for... how to say this? All of this makes for very wariness for, say, Jack Aubrey to have any close encounters with government officials and admiralty. And it's one of the reasons why he spends as much time as possible out on the water, and subsequently makes him just an expert seaman. We get to get some details about the royal dockyards and how they would retrofit any captured vessels from any of the other people that they're encountering on the sea. And that just expands the British Armada more quickly than building a new ship from scratch. And the chapter ends mentioning a little bit more of Ireland and their role in this time frame. Dr. Stephen Maturin himself is of Irish and Catalan descent, and it talks briefly about like an Irish rebellion. And at the time, see, Ireland was close enough for the French fleets to make engagements there, and they battled the British on that part of the ocean as well. Chapter 3 is entitled Hearts of Oak. Now, over the course of the 20-book completed series, we found our stalwart captain is busy heading different ships over time. Some of the names of the book actually refer to the various titles in the British hierarchy of commanders. So, Master and Commander is one. That's actually a title given to a certain captain of a certain ship. Post Captain is another one. Commodore, Yellow Admiral. These are all related to different ranks in the British Navy. And some of these ranks are commensurate with the size or the number of cannons that are on board a specific ship. The bigger the ship, the bigger the rank. You get demoted in ship, you're kind of demoted in rank simultaneously. Over the course of the novels, we get to see Captain Jack move from one size of a ship to another, and sometimes even back again. From having 13 cannon and cannonades up to 40 and greater so on above that. A lot of these ships were christened as first rate on up to sixth rate. First rate ships carried 100 cannon or more guns, typically on 3 decks. Second rates, maybe between 80 and 100 gun. Third, maybe 70 to 80, but now you're only on 2 decks, and so on down the line until you get to the 6th rate, which is like 20 to 30 guns, crewed by maybe 120 to 190 men. And the chapter goes into a little bit of detail on the construction of some of the ships, some notes on the construction of the French ships, and the wood and the masts, how they were built, where they got the wood from, all that. Because shipbuilding materials was extremely important, and as war times move forward over the years, they need to get more supplies because they've run out of their own from elsewhere, which may mean sailing to far shores and ports, which may mean getting into other engagements along the way or back. And now if you go to, say, Brazil and get their trees to bring back to England for shipbuilding, the French may want to take over that ship because now they want the wood as well, and it becomes a big resource fight on the open seas. The 4th chapter, A Life on the Ocean Wave. We get to delve more into the crew in this one, because there was a severe shortage of men to actually crew all of these boats. And they would try to bribe people on the streets, saying, hey, we'll give you a bonus if you want to come on board. They would conscript able-bodied men and basically imprison them to work on the ships. Sometimes they would actually let the criminals out of prison to man the ships. Or they would capture men at sea and force them into the crew. The point being, one criminal or captured man among 20 sailors of the ship, he'll do the work and he'll avoid getting a beatdown. At which point, you now have an extra able-bodied man by taking the people who don't want to be there and scattering them among the retinue all over the Navy. Along with the crewmen, the chapter goes into the organization of the ship, the different watches, the stations, the crew quarters, where to report when there's a call to action, and also the various ranks of midshipmen, marines, and officers on board. It also goes into some detail regarding officers' uniforms and how to tell their rank one from the other. The living conditions on board the boat. Sanitation, food, mealtimes, and fare. Crimes and how punishment was dealt. And just a detail of the hazards of working on board a frigate, from slipping from the rigging, to foundering, to shipwrecks. Moving on to the 5th chapter, called Eyes of the Fleet. This is one of those chapters where you now get to see a little bit more of the details of the source of who Captain Jack Aubrey was modeled after. There was one man by the name of Thomas Cochrane. At the time, notice one of the... gotta slow down a little bit. At time, notice one of the finest frigate commanders in the Navy. His taking of the enemy ships, his ability to obtain considerable prize money, they are all echoed in Jack Aubrey's actions throughout the books. Also, even Cochrane criticized Parliament and the need for naval reform, but that got him kind of ousted amongst that society and scuppered any other further seagoing commands that might raise in his career. These things, they actually apply to Jack Aubrey as well, when he can. And the chapter also goes into detail some of Cochrane's most famous prizes during his career. And the chapter kind of continues on, talking of the evolution of the frigate and warship design, the use of smaller sixth-rate ships and sloops in the line of battle, some of the classic duels of the sea for its time, and how the novels tie into it during its 20-book historical fiction run. Getting towards the end, Chapter 6 is entitled The Thunder of Battle. It's a chapter solely devoted to the order of battle and how the engagements went down. And while there were no formalized rules of war, there were a number of well-understood combat conventions observed by both sides. Such things as, when a captain of a defeated ship goes to surrender, they try to surrender with honor. They strike their colors from the mast. He presents his sword to the opposing captain. Also such things as, say a smaller ship was brave enough to try to take on a larger ship, like a 13-gun ship taking on a 30-gun ship, and by some unforeseen or amazing feat, the larger ship is going to just give in. They're going to say, you win, don't kill anybody, take the ship. There's like a rule, kind of like a rule of thumb, unwritten rule, whatever you want to call it, that the larger ship would actually let the smaller ship fire a full broadside. Okay? And that would kind of like satisfy them. And the token broadside would then let the larger ship, immediately surrender. They illustrate this in one of the earlier books too, so it doesn't come as a surprise if you know this in advance. Pardon me. They also go into discussions of convoys, blockades, And by the way, blockade action being apparently very, very boring to the crewmen on board, because you're just sitting there waiting. Sorry, there'd be like 7 ships lined up, just waiting to see if an enemy ship would come out of their port. And because of it being so boring, blockades are where most of the mutinies that you ever see happening at sea occur. They just need something to break the boredom. A later section in this chapter goes into the details of ship-by-ship communications, how they came up with the whole flag system, what the different flags meant, and then people would take that and even expound on it later on. This actually allowed the communications between ships that were miles apart, but you could see from a lookout through a spyglass to say, hey, I see something going on there. Because they even have details of one of the actions where the fleet was behind and they sent a ship way in ahead in advance. And when he saw something, he started flagging and doing things with lights to let everyone else know, hey, we're running into this. I can see it, you can't see it yet. Why? Because the Earth is round. And they go so far out, the guy that's on here can see it better than this one if someone's down here. There follows many illustrations and examples of successful sea tactics, from Admiral Nelson at the Nile and in Cape St. Vincent. There's something termed the Walcheren expedition in 1809, which involved ships actually being grounded, and they hit sandbars or shallows, and they gotta unload the ship to a recent shore or to a nearby shore, and then drag it across the sandbar to then reload it and continue on. And in this example, they actually made it as supporting defense of an action down the river, so to speak. And they talk about a famous battle of Lake Erie among smaller vessels and corvettes between the Americans and the British. An action that was carried out as if the ships were part of a grand fleet and part of a line of battleships. Oh, it goes into some great detail here for you. And then we finalize the last chapter, chapter 7, called Scoundrels and Malefactors. Finally, we get to see the discipline, or maybe lack thereof, of some of the seamen on board these long ocean-going frigates. At times, one of these ships, even though they're part of the Navy, could receive a letter of marque. M-A-R-Q-U-E, marque. And it basically allowed cannon-bearing ships to a form of legal piracy, so long as they were raiding opposing ships, and not just any merchantmen not involved in the battles. However, if a ship decided, say, that is a supply ship for the French, they can board it, they can ransack it, and take some of the prize. But it was important to hold back some of the crewmen from actually devolving into piracy and how they were doing it. Killing people unnecessarily, raping people, that kind of action. It moves along and it actually discusses slave ships at sea. And the sections that talk of it, they kind of talk about the rise and the diminishing of the slave trade and what they do to some of the ships they actually do encounter. Then, since we're talking about scoundrels and malefactors, we talk about mutinies and how they arise. Besides boredom along a blockade. One example, there's a ship called the Hermione, where the captain was just callous toward his crew. Shipmates would fall from the rigging and land on the deck, and he would just unceremoniously throw them into the ocean, not even giving them a burial at sea. And one of the reasons why they would fall from the rigging is he instilled a protocol on board where when they switched the watch during a day or night, the last one down from the rigging would be punished, or you'd be flogged. And everyone was fighting to be not the last one down. And his thing was if you're the last one down, you must not be an able seaman. Well, of course, someone had to be the last one down, even on a well-run ship. And when a mutiny would actually occur, if the mutineers win, they might just steer the ship over to the opposition. Say it was a mutiny on an English ship, they'd go to France or they'd go to Spain and say, we present this ship to you. And then the mutineers would either go into hiding or sometimes change their identity and get back on another ship. And since there was such a shortage of able men to handle a ship, some ship captains would turn an eye to these practices and have just to have a good crew member on board. But most often, mutineers would be found out and turned to the authorities. And some of these instances are done within the 20-book series. And then it finishes up with, desertions, what they would do with theft of property on board a ship, punishments enacted, lashed a guy with a cat of nine tails. They discuss all this in the chapter. So, there you have it. Not bad for a coffee table book, if I must say so myself. It gives you a pretty good, decent background of what those years were like, both in the war, in the economies, on the ship, and everything else. And you get to see some really great art when you're going through it. I tagged a couple real quick to see if I can throw it up to the camera for you, but here's one here. I can't see this stuff. Just wonderful oil paintings of a ship on fire during an action. I got one more example I've already tagged here for as well. This one not as yellow and fiery, but more blue and sky and ocean going. I just see this. That's a beautiful one. In fact, I wasn't considering doing this, but I have one thing to show you. So I actually had the privilege in the past year of seeing the new American submarine being launched called the USS New Jersey. And I am from New Jersey. I love New Jersey. So seeing a new ship being christened by the Navy and given their first orders, when are you going to do that? And the fact that it was done by for a New Jersey named boat was amazing. And apparently there's only been 3 ships in the U.S. Navy ever named the New Jersey, this being the most recent. But some guy made a painting of it, and we got this as swag. So this is the submarine New Jersey, and in the background are pictures of the other 2 New Jerseys that have happened over the years. So I'm actually going to frame this myself at one point and put this on the wall in my office. So, again, that was just a special little add-on. And like I said, this is an illustrated companion. Shows different watercolors and paintings, much like this one was. Just absolutely fantastic stuff. So again, just in conclusion, if ocean battles and life at sea and things of that nature are something that you would be interested in, I do recommend this series of books by Patrick O'Brian to you, to just ingest during your reading time. And as for this book, this might actually be a pretty decent primer to check out before you read those books. And I say, it will get you grounded in the time. You'll understand what the people were like a little bit. You'll understand what the ships, what their importance were, what the hierarchy was. And it's a good jumping off point for what can come in those remaining 20 novels. Not 100% necessary. And I didn't do it in that order because I didn't know about this in advance. But it could be a good order to tackle this saga. So if you get a chance, this book's around, you'll be able to find a copy. Okay. In the meantime, I didn't expect to go 35 minutes today, but here it is. Thank you for being here. I unfortunately have a backlog of books to get around to because I'm reading them faster than I take my notes and give these videos. But, hey, more to come. All right. Thank you very much for your time. Bye-bye now.